Trafalgar Square, that venerable heart of London, pulsed with the gentle rhythm of a summer morning. Pigeons, plump and unafraid, cooed their familiar melody, a counterpoint to the brisk clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages and the steady shuffle of foot traffic that already thronged the wide expanse. Sunlight, still bearing the soft gold of dawn, bathed the stone lions at Nelson's Column, casting long, elegant shadows that stretched and danced across the paving stones. It was, by all accounts, a perfect London day, the kind that postcards are made of, the sort that draws tourists from every corner of the globe, eager to breathe in the history and soak in the atmosphere. Yet, for Sergeant James Blackwood of His Majesty's Royal Guard, a subtle unease, a discordant note in the symphony of the morning, began to prickle at the edges of his awareness. Standing sentinel before the wrought-iron gates of Buckingham Palace, James was, to the casual observer, as much a fixture of this iconic scene as the palace itself. His posture was ramrod straight, his scarlet tunic impeccably pressed, the black bearskin cap casting his face in a dignified shade. He was, in essence, the embodiment of tradition, a living, breathing symbol of the steadfast duty that had defined the British monarchy for centuries. But beneath the polished leather of his boots and the starched crispness of his uniform, Sergeant Blackwood was acutely sensitive to the subtle shifts in the world around him. Years of disciplined training, honed by countless hours standing watch in all manner of weather and amidst throngs of every conceivable disposition, had sharpened his senses to an almost preternatural degree. He could discern the shift in the wind's direction with the barest tremor against his cheek, recognize the nuances in the changing cadence of footsteps approaching from afar, and even sense the subtle undercurrents of emotion rippling through the crowds he observed. Today, it was a feeling, not a sound or sight, that stirred his apprehension. It was a subtle weight in the air, a heaviness that clung to the sun-drenched square like a damp mist refusing to burn off. It was as if an invisible shadow, unconnected to any cloud in the azure sky above, had fallen across the vibrant scene, muting its usual cheerful hum, replacing it with a low, almost imperceptible thrum of something unsettled. James shifted, his weight imperceptibly, the polished heel of his boot making the faintest whisper against the stone. His gaze, unwavering, swept across the panorama before him, taking in the familiar tableau of tourists snapping photos, families strolling hand in hand, the occasional businessman hurrying past, phone pressed to his ear. Everything appeared as it should be. Yet the disquiet lingered, a persistent whisper at the back of his mind. "It's nothing," he told himself, his thoughts echoing the quiet resolve that had been forged in the crucible of his training. Just nerves. Another day. Another. Watch, duty calls, and duty demands unwavering focus. He straightened his spine a fraction more, the gesture almost imperceptible, a silent assertion of control. He thought of his grandfather, a veteran of the Second World War, a man of few words but immense quiet strength who had instilled in him the unwavering value of duty and honor. "A man's word, James," he could almost hear his grandfather's gravelly voice, "is his bond. And your duty, lad, is your word to king and country. Never falter." The words, though unspoken, resonated deeply within him, anchoring him to the present moment, to his post, to his unwavering commitment. He was a Blackwood, and Blackwoods had served with honor for generations. Discipline was in his blood, loyalty etched into his very bones. Yet the unease persisted. He scanned the crowd again, his eyes lingering for a fraction longer than usual. On each face, each group, each interaction, there was nothing outwardly amiss, no obvious threat, no hint of danger. And yet, perhaps it was the way the sunlight seemed to catch the edge of the fountain, just a little too sharply, glinting with an almost unnatural brilliance. Or maybe it was the slightly too loud laughter of a group of tourists gathered near the palace gates, their merriment jarring against the normally serene atmosphere. Or perhaps it was simply the way a lone pigeon suddenly took flight from Nelson's Column, its wings beating a frantic rhythm against the stillness of the air, a flurry of gray against the clear blue sky. Small things, insignificant things, perhaps, and yet, woven together, they created a subtle tapestry of disquiet, A sense that the perfect facade of this London morning was paper-thin, and that something unexpected, something disruptive, was poised to break through. James took a slow, deliberate breath, the air cool and crisp in his lungs. He focused on the weight of his rifle in his hands, the familiar feel of the polished wood, the cold certainty of the steel. He was a royal guard. He was trained to observe, to protect, to remain steadfast in the face of any challenge. He would stand his post. He would remain silent. He would watch. But the shadow over the square, that intangible weight in the air, refused to dissipate. It lingered, a silent promise of disruption, a subtle premonition that this seemingly perfect London morning was about to take a very unexpected and potentially very unsettling turn. And Sergeant James Blackwood, despite his years of training and unwavering resolve, could not shake the feeling that something somewhere was terribly amiss. The pigeons cooed, the sun shone, the crowds bustled, but the shadow remained, a silent sentinel of its own, waiting, watching, and promising a disturbance to the peace. Karen Reynolds emerged from the gleaming black taxi onto the bustling pavement, with the practiced air of a woman accustomed to commanding attention. Her designer sunglasses, perched atop a meticulously coiffed blonde bob, shielded eyes that had seen the world, or at least the meticulously curated corners of it that catered to her considerable wealth and discerning tastes. A linen pantsuit, the color of perfectly ripened peaches, flowed around her with an effortless elegance that spoke of Savile Row tailoring and a wardrobe that likely spanned continents. Around her neck, a strand of pearls, each orb luminous and perfectly matched, whispered of old money and understated, yet undeniable power. She surveyed Buckingham Palace, the iconic facade shimmering in the strengthening sunlight, with a gaze that was less appreciative admiration and more inventory assessment. London for Mrs. Reynolds was just another stop on a well-trod itinerary of global capitals, a city to be checked off a list, photographed against, and perhaps subtly critiqued against the perceived superiorities of her native New York. The very air seemed to hum with history and tradition, a weight of centuries that, to Karen's American sensibilities, felt both quaint and slightly stifling. Imposing, I suppose, she declared to her impeccably dressed and equally worldly weary companion. Charles, a fellow traveler and longtime friend whose role in life seemed primarily to validate Karen's pronouncements on all matters of culture, cuisine, and couture. Charles obligingly offered a measured nod, adjusting the silk scarf draped just so over his own linen jacket. Quite Karen, though perhaps a tad stodgy for my taste. Karen allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Stodgy. Yes, that was precisely the word. London, with its rigid adherence to protocol and its almost theatrical displays of pomp and circumstance, felt decidedly stodgy compared to the vibrant, ever-evolving dynamism of her beloved Manhattan. The royal guards in their scarlet tunics and towering bearskin hats struck her as particularly, well, theatrical, almost cartoonish in their unwavering stillness. As they approached the gates, where Sergeant James Blackwood stood sentinel, Karen's gaze sharpened with a certain curiosity. Or perhaps it was something closer to detached anthropological interest. The young man, with his dark skin a striking contrast to the crimson of his uniform, was undeniably striking in his rigid posture and stoic expression. But to Karen's eye, he was also other, a symbol perhaps of a bygone era, a relic of a tradition that felt increasingly anachronistic in the modern world. Are they even real? She mused aloud, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard by those nearby, a deliberate ripple of amusement in her tone. Or are they just mannequins, Charles? Rather elaborate ones, I'll grant you, but still, mannequins nonetheless. Charles chuckled obligingly, though a flicker of unease crossed his perpetually mild features. Karen, darling, really. Of course they're real, perfectly real, and I wouldn't recommend testing that particular hypothesis. He offered a subtle, almost imperceptible tug at the sleeve of her peach-colored jacket, a silent plea for restraint. But Karen, emboldened by the sun, the admiring glances of passers-by, and the ever-present echo chamber of her own self-importance, was not to be deterred. A mischievous glint sparked in her shielded eyes. The very stillness of the guard, his unwavering, almost unnerving immobility, seemed to present a challenge, an irresistible invitation to disruption. She approached Sergeant Blackwood with a deliberate, almost theatrical flourish, her high heels clicking sharply against the paving stones. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that the faint scent of starch and polished leather reached her nostrils, close enough to observe the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest beneath the scarlet tunic. "Excuse me," she began, her voice pitched just loud enough to cut through the ambient hum of the square, each word carefully enunciated with a distinct New York inflection, a subtle weapon in her arsenal of social dominance. "Guard, hello? Anyone home in there?" Sergeant Blackwood, as expected, remained unmoving, unblinking, a statue carved from flesh and blood, tradition, and discipline. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead, focused on some distant, unseen point beyond the throngs of tourists. Karen pressed on undeterred. I said, "Hello. Are you deaf or just instructed to be rude?" She leaned closer, tilting her head, her voice taking on a sharper, more pointed edge. "Honestly, it's quite absurd, isn't it? All this dressing up and standing around, pretending to be what exactly? Important?" A few onlookers began to pause, their conversations momentarily suspended, drawn in by the unfolding, slightly unsettling drama. A mother tightened her grip on her child's hand. A young couple exchanged uneasy glances. The light-hearted atmosphere of the square began to subtly shift, the cheerful hum replaced by a nervous undercurrent of anticipation. Charles shifted uncomfortably beside Karen, his earlier amusement replaced by a growing sense of apprehension. He cleared his throat, attempting a placating intervention. "Karen, perhaps we should move along? The changing of the guard ceremony is starting soon, and—" Karen waved a dismissive hand, her attention fixed solely on the unyielding figure before her. She was in that moment utterly consumed by a perverse desire to provoke, to shatter the stillness, to elicit a reaction, to prove, perhaps only to herself, that this seemingly impenetrable facade of British stoicism was, in fact, just that. A facade. "Tell me," she continued, her voice now laced with a thinly veiled condescension, "do you even think behind that ridiculous hat? Or is it all just programmed like some sort of wind-up toy soldier?" She reached out a perfectly manicured hand, her fingers hovering inches from the impassive face beneath the bearskin cap. "Are you even human in there?" And then, in a moment that would be replayed and dissected countless times in the hours and days to come, in a flash of breathtaking audacity fueled by ego, entitlement, and a profound miscalculation of the silent strength before her, Karen Reynolds acted, ignoring the subtle tremor of warning that finally, belatedly, flickered across Sergeant Blackwood's otherwise unyielding features, disregarding the collective intake of breath from the onlookers who had gathered to witness this unfolding spectacle, and utterly oblivious to the gathering storm of consequences that was about to erupt. Karen Reynolds, with a dismissive flick of her wrist, slapped the royal guard across the face. The sound, sharp and shockingly resonant in the suddenly hushed square, cracked through the air like a physical blow. The world, for a breathless, suspended moment, seemed to hold its breath, and the carefully constructed facade of a perfect London morning, fractured irrevocably, began to crumble. The shadow over the square, no longer an intangible premonition, had descended, sharp and undeniable, with the resounding crack of Karen Reynolds' open palm. The resounding crack of Karen Reynolds' hand against Sergeant James Blackwood's cheek seemed to hang in the air, an invisible shockwave rippling outward through the stunned silence of Trafalgar Square. For a fleeting, almost surreal moment, time itself appeared to stutter, suspended in the aftermath of the unthinkable. Then, reality reasserted itself, rushing back in a torrent of whispered gasps, murmured exclamations, and the frantic rustle of movement as the previously placid crowd surged forward. A collective organism suddenly jolted awake. Onlookers, initially frozen in disbelief, began to stir, their faces a mixture of shock, outrage, and a morbid fascination with the spectacle that had just unfolded before them. A collective intake of breath, a sharp, almost painful sound, swept through the square as people processed the sheer audacity of what they had witnessed. A woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A man sputtered, his face reddening with indignation. A child, momentarily forgotten by his parents, simply stared, wide-eyed and bewildered at the unfolding drama. Sergeant Blackwood, however, remained an island of unwavering stillness amidst the rising tide of human reaction. Despite the undeniable sting of the slap, the raw insult of the physical assault, he stood as if carved from granite, his posture unyielding, his gaze fixed resolutely ahead. Not a muscle twitched, not an eyelid fluttered, not a flicker of emotion betrayed the inner turmoil that must surely have been raging beneath the stoic facade. He was, in that moment, the very embodiment of discipline, a testament to the rigorous training that had been etched into his very being. But the silence, the stunned hush that had followed the slap, was fragile, ephemeral. It was broken almost instantly by the frantic tapping of fingers on smartphone screens, as Karen Reynolds, momentarily stunned by her own audacity, stood frozen. In place, a dozen, then dozens of onlookers reacted with the reflexive immediacy of the digital age. Smartphones, once discreetly tucked away, were now brandished like weapons, capturing the scene from every conceivable angle. Videos began to flicker to life, recording the aftermath, the shocked faces, the unwavering guard, and the still present figure of Karen Reynolds, now beginning to betray the first nascent tremors of unease. Within minutes, the first grainy, shaky videos began to surface online. Initially trickling onto platforms like Twitter and Facebook, they were quickly amplified by the voracious algorithms of the internet, propelled by the potent cocktail of shock value, outrage, and the inherent fascination with the seemingly sacrosanct. Royal Guards. Hashtags began to bloom, tentative at first, then gaining momentum with each passing second. Yaks Royal Guard slap, Yaks Buckingham Palace assault, Box Karen attacks guard. The digital wildfire had been ignited. The internet, that vast and often capricious ocean of public opinion, roared to life. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and overwhelmingly condemnatory. Karen Reynolds, initially a nameless face in a crowd, was swiftly identified, her social media profiles unearthed, her life, or at least her carefully curated online persona, laid bare for public consumption and judgment. The digital mob descended, with the swift, merciless efficiency that only the internet could muster. Comment sections exploded in a cacophony of outrage. Disgusting! Unbelievable! Arrest her! The initial shock quickly morphed into a tidal wave of indignation, fueled by a potent mix of national pride, outrage at the perceived disrespect shown to a symbol of British heritage, and, perhaps, a deeper, more primal sense of injustice at the sight of perceived entitlement and arrogance, directed at a figure representing quiet dignity and unwavering service. News outlets, both mainstream and online, scrambled to pick up the story. "American tourist slaps Royal Guard at Buckingham Palace," blared headlines, amplified by dramatic images and looped videos of the incident. Television news programs led with the story, broadcasting footage of the slap to millions of viewers worldwide. Radio talk shows crackled with heated debates, callers passionately voicing their opinions, the airwaves thick with righteous anger and calls for swift and decisive action. The reaction was, in a word, viral. It transcended borders, languages, and cultural divides. The image of Karen Reynolds' hand connecting with Sergeant Blackwood's face became a global symbol, a shorthand for disrespect, entitlement, and a perceived cultural clash. The internet, in its vast and interconnected sprawl, had found a new object of collective outrage, and it was fixated, unblinking, on Karen Reynolds. Karen, oblivious to the digital tsunami that was rapidly engulfing her, initially remained in a state of bewildered disbelief. Seated in the plush, if somewhat impersonal confines of her London hotel suite, she scrolled through her phone, her designer sunglasses perched precariously on her nose, a half-empty glass of champagne trembling slightly in her hand. The sheer volume of notifications, the relentless pinging and buzzing, initially registered as a minor annoyance, a digital mosquito buzzing irritatingly around her head. "Charles, darling, do take a look at this," she murmured, her voice laced with a mixture of confusion and irritation. My phone is simply awash with notifications. Something about going viral? Charles, paler than usual and visibly sweating despite the cool air conditioning of the suite, approached, with a hesitant step, peering over her shoulder at the glowing screen. His eyes widened, the mild composure he usually maintained cracking under the weight of what he was seeing. "Karen," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. You really must see this. It appears, well, it appears to be rather significant." As Karen began to grasp the enormity of the digital storm she had unleashed, the champagne suddenly lost its effervescence. The plush suite felt increasingly like a gilded cage, and the unease that had flickered in Sergeant Blackwood's eyes, before the slap now mirrored, with chilling accuracy, the cold dread that began to settle in the pit of her own perfectly manicured stomach. The roar of the crowd, amplified by the digital age, was rising, and Karen Reynolds, for the first time, began to understand that she had unwittingly stepped onto a stage far larger and far more unforgiving than she could ever have imagined. The reality of her situation descended upon Karen Reynolds not in a sudden cataclysmic crash, but in a slow, insidious seep, like a chilling fog rolling in from the Thames, gradually enveloping her in its clammy embrace. Seated in the opulent, yet impersonal living room of her hotel suite, the panoramic view of London now feeling less like a privilege and more like a mocking reminder of her public transgression, Karen initially clung to disbelief. It couldn't be this bad, could it? A momentary lapse of judgment, a slightly overzealous gesture, blown entirely out of proportion by the rabid hyperbole of the internet. Surely, it would all just dissipate. The news cycle was notoriously fickle, attention spans fleeting. By tomorrow, something else, some other outrage, would capture the collective digital consciousness, and this unpleasantness would simply fade away. This was her initial fragile defense, a shield woven from denial and the ingrained belief that her wealth and social standing afforded her a certain degree of insulation from the messy realities that plagued the common masses. She was, after all, Karen Reynolds. Such uncouth. Things simply didn't happen to people like her. But the relentless buzz and ping of her smartphone, now a constant, irritating companion rather than a reassuring link to her carefully curated world, chipped away at this carefully constructed facade of denial. Each notification, each jarring vibration, was a tiny hammer blow against her carefully crafted self-image, a persistent reminder that the world outside her gilded cage was not behaving according to her expectations. Charles, pacing the Persian, rug in front of the fireplace with the nervous energy of a caged animal himself, was far less sanguine. His usual urbane composure had crumbled, replaced by a jittery anxiety that manifested in incessant fidgeting with his silk scarf and increasingly frantic glances at the constantly obnovlayashisa newsfeed on his own phone. "Karen, darling," he began again, his voice pitched a nervous octave higher than usual. "You really must understand the gravity of this. This isn't just some fleeting internet kerfuffle. This is everywhere. Global news. Everywhere, Karen." He gestured vaguely with his phone, as if the device itself held the weight of the world's condemnation. "They're calling it unprecedented. International incident. Some are even using the C word, Karen. Criminal, Karen." Flinched, the casual dismissiveness momentarily faltering. "Criminal? Charles, please. Don't be so melodramatic." It was a slap. A silly, impulsive, admittedly ill-advised slap. Not a crime against humanity. She attempted a light laugh, but it emerged as a thin, brittle sound, lacking any genuine humor. Charles stopped pacing, turning to face her, his brow furrowed with worry. "Karen, with all due respect, you are simply not grasping the symbolism. The Royal Guard, Buckingham Palace, the flag, Karen. You slapped a symbol, darling. A very potent symbol of British everything. And the internet. Well, the internet thrives on symbols, doesn't it?" He was right, of course. Even Karen, in her state of denial, could intellectually grasp the point. It wasn't just about a slap. It was about who she had slapped, where she had slapped him, and what that silent, scarlet-clad figure represented in the collective British psyche. She had transgressed against something far larger than a mere man. She had, in the eyes of millions, affronted an ideal, a tradition, a cornerstone of national identity. The realization, however, was slow to translate from intellectual understanding to visceral comprehension. Years of privilege and a lifetime spent navigating a world that often bent to her will had created a deep-seated sense of invulnerability. Consequences, for Karen Reynolds, were usually something that happened to other people, the less fortunate, the less connected. Not to her. Yet the relentless barrage of digital detritus seeping into her gilded cage was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Her phone, usually a source of carefully curated validation and social affirmation, was now a conduit for a torrent of vitriol and condemnation. Hateful messages flooded her social media accounts, punctuated by crude memes and digitally defaced images of her face superimposed onto unflattering caricatures. Online petitions demanding her arrest and imprisonment were rapidly accumulating signatures, fueled by righteous fury and a global thirst for digital justice. Even the usually sycophantic staff at the hotel, while outwardly polite and deferential, seemed to regard her with a new, subtly altered gaze. The deferential smiles felt a touch too strained, the polite inquiries about her comfort a shade too perfunctory. She could sense a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle withdrawal, as if she had become tainted, radioactive, someone to be handled with extreme caution lest the digital contagion spread. The gilded cage, once a sanctuary of luxury and indulgence, now felt increasingly like a prison, isolating her from the world she knew, trapping her within the suffocating confines of her own making. The storm, initially a distant rumble on the horizon, was now gathering directly overhead, and Karen Reynolds, for the first time in a very long and privileged life, began to feel the chilling premonition of genuine, tangible consequences. The internet, it seemed, did not discriminate based on wealth, status, or designer labels, and the world, amplified and interconnected by its digital nervous system, was watching, waiting, and demanding a reckoning for the slap heard round. The world. Isabelle Dubois arrived in London with the quiet determination of a seasoned observer, a quality honed by years spent navigating bustling newsrooms and chasing elusive truths in far-flung corners of the globe. Stepping off the Eurostar at St. Pancras International, she blended seamlessly into the throng of commuters and tourists. Her unobtrusive demeanor and practical attire, a sensible trench coat, dark trousers, and comfortable walking shoes, designed to attract minimal attention. Unlike Karen Reynolds, who seemed to crave the spotlight, Isabelle preferred to operate in the shadows, her strength lying in her keen observation skills and her unwavering commitment to uncovering the story beneath the surface. At 25, Isabelle possessed a maturity and world-weariness that belied her youth. Years of working as a freelance journalist, bouncing between assignments in Paris and beyond, had etched lines of focus around her intelligent, hazel eyes and imbued her with a quiet intensity. She had witnessed firsthand the messy complexities of human nature, the seductive allure of power, and the corrosive impact of misinformation in the digital age. It was this very understanding of the world's often murky underbelly that drew her to the Karen slaps Guard story, a seemingly simple act of provocation that had detonated into a global media frenzy. For Isabelle, the viral video was more than just a fleeting internet sensation. Beneath the layers of outrage and condemnation, she sensed a deeper, more nuanced narrative waiting to be unearthed. The stark contrast between the unflinching stoicism of the Royal Guard and the seemingly impulsive arrogance of the American tourist intrigued her. It was a clash of cultures, a microcosm of larger societal tensions, amplified and distorted by the relentless echo chamber of social media. And Isabelle, with her journalist's instincts, knew there was more to the story than met the eye. Checking into a small, unassuming hotel in Bloomsbury, far removed from the gilded luxury favored by Karen Reynolds, Isabelle immediately set to work. She eschewed the frantic pace of the mainstream media, choosing instead to approach the story with methodical precision, piece by painstaking piece. Her first task, to immerse herself in the atmosphere of Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square, to absorb the ambiance, to observe the rhythms of daily life that formed the backdrop to the viral incident. The following morning, Isabelle found herself standing amidst the throngs of tourists in Trafalgar Square, the very location where Karen Reynolds' slap had echoed across the globe. She watched the royal guards on duty, their movements precise, their expressions impassive, their presence a constant reassuring anchor in the swirling currents of human activity. She observed the tourists, their cameras clicking, their voices, a multilingual hum, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of the same disquiet that had settled over Sergeant Blackwood on that fateful morning. Isabelle spent hours simply absorbing the sensory details of the square, the sunlight glinting off the fountains, the pigeons strutting with casual confidence, the snippets of conversations in a dozen different languages, the ever-present backdrop of London's iconic architecture. It was a vibrant, multifaceted tapestry of human life, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that a thread had been violently yanked loose, leaving a raw, exposed edge. She began to approach onlookers, starting with those who appeared to be independent observers, less caught up in the tourist frenzy, an elderly gentleman sketching in a notebook, a young woman reading a book on a park bench, a street vendor selling postcards. These were the individuals Isabelle sought out, their perspectives perhaps less influenced by the immediate viral outrage and more grounded in personal observation. Her approach was gentle, unassuming, her French accent a subtle icebreaker. She introduced herself as a journalist, explaining her interest in understanding the broader context of the event, not just the sensationalized headlines. She asked open-ended questions, prompting them to share their personal impressions of the incident, their thoughts on the royal guards, and their feelings about the viral reaction. The responses were varied, a kaleidoscope of opinions and emotions. Some echoed the prevailing outrage, condemning Karen Reynolds in no uncertain terms, branding her as disrespectful, arrogant, and emblematic of a perceived decline in Western civility. Others offered more nuanced perspectives, expressing sympathy for the royal guard while acknowledging the complexities of human behavior and the dangers of snap judgments fueled by social media. A few even confessed to a sense of unease, a feeling that the viral frenzy had become disproportionate, overshadowing the human element of the story. One elderly woman, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she reminisced, shared a story of seeing the royal guards as a child, a memory imbued with a sense of national pride and childhood wonder. A young student, his brow furrowed in thought, spoke of the pressures of social media and the speed at which online mobs could form and condemn. A street vendor, his weathered face reflecting years spent observing the ebb and flow of human traffic through Trafalgar Square, simply sighed and shook his head, muttering something about the world gone mad. From each conversation, Isabelle gleaned a small thread, a fragment of perspective, a piece of the larger puzzle. She meticulously recorded her interviews, her notebook filling with observations, quotes, and names. She felt a growing sense of purpose, a conviction that the story of Karen Slap's guard was not just about a single act of provocation, but about something far more profound: the fragility of respect in a world increasingly defined by instant judgment, the enduring power of symbols, and the complex, often contradictory nature of human behavior itself. And as the London sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows once more across Trafalgar Square, Isabelle Dubois, the outsider's eye, knew that her investigation had only just begun, and that the path to uncovering the truth would be far more intricate and challenging than she could have initially imagined. Isabelle Dubois, having absorbed the diverse chorus of public opinion swirling around the Karen Slap's guard incident, now turned her methodical gaze towards the epicenter of the storm, Karen Reynolds herself. The viral video and the ensuing media frenzy had painted a stark, two-dimensional portrait of the American tourist, a wealthy, entitled woman, casually dispensing disrespect and physical assault with equal measure. But Isabelle, seasoned journalist that she was, knew that reality rarely conformed to such simplistic narratives. There were always layers beneath the surface, complexities obscured by the glare of public judgment, and motivations far more intricate than readily apparent. Her initial foray into Karen Reynolds' world began, as it so often did in the digital age, with a screen and a search engine. The internet, that vast repository of curated personas and carefully constructed realities, yielded a wealth of information, or at least the illusion of information. Karen Reynolds, it turned out, was a relatively public figure, albeit one who operated primarily within the rarefied circles of Manhattan's elite. Her LinkedIn profile presented a polished image of a successful businesswoman, the CEO of a boutique marketing firm specializing in luxury brands. Smiling headshots, professionally lit and airbrushed to perfection, showcased a woman exuding confidence and competence. Her resume, meticulously detailed, chronicled a trajectory of upward mobility, from prestigious universities to high-powered executive positions, punctuated by glowing testimonials and industry accolades. It was a portrait of achievement, ambition, and effortless success, the embodiment of the American dream, meticulously crafted and presented for public consumption. Isabelle delved deeper, venturing into the labyrinthine world of social media. Karen Reynolds' Instagram feed was a carefully curated tableau of aspirational living, sun-drenched vacations in exotic locales, elegant cocktail parties amidst glittering cityscapes, meticulously plated meals in Michelin-starred restaurants, and of course a steady stream of perfectly posed selfies, each showcasing a flawless complexion and a wardrobe that could rival a fashion magazine's editorial spread. The accompanying captions were equally polished, a blend of aspirational platitudes and carefully chosen hashtags designed to project an image of sophisticated success and effortless joie de vivre. Facebook offered a slightly more personal glimpse, or at least a performance of one. Photos of charity galas and philanthropic endeavors mingled with carefully staged snapshots of candid moments, laughing with impeccably dressed friends, reading weighty-looking novels on sun loungers, attending exclusive cultural events, all meticulously documenting a life of privileged ease and effortless social grace. Even her Twitter feed, though less visually oriented, echoed the same carefully constructed persona. Witty pronouncements on current events, carefully chosen links to articles that aligned with her presumed worldview, and polite, almost perfunctory, interactions with a network of equally polished and successful-seeming individuals. As Isabelle scrolled through the digital artifacts of Karen Reynolds' online existence, a sense of unease began to settle in. It was all too perfect, too flawlessly curated, too devoid of any discernible imperfection, any hint of vulnerability, any glimpse of authentic human complexity. It was a meticulously constructed facade, a shimmering digital mirage designed to project an image of unattainable perfection. But behind the flawless surface, Isabelle sensed a void, a carefully concealed emptiness, a story untold. The Karen Reynolds presented online was a caricature, a carefully crafted brand, not a breathing, feeling human being. Where was the real woman beneath the designer labels and the aspirational hashtags? What anxieties, what insecurities, what hidden complexities lay beneath the polished veneer of success? What, if anything, could explain the jarring disconnect between this carefully constructed online persona and the impulsive, aggressive behavior captured in the viral video? Isabelle closed her laptop, leaning back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. The digital breadcrumbs had led her to a meticulously crafted image, but they had revealed little of substance, offered no real clues to the woman behind the slap. To truly understand Karen Reynolds, to unravel the motivations behind her actions, Isabelle knew she would have to move beyond the superficiality of the internet and delve into the messy, unpredictable realm of the real world. Her next step, she decided, would be to attempt to reach out, to pierce through the digital wall and make contact with the woman herself, or at least those within her orbit. She began to draft an email, carefully crafting a message that was both professional and persuasive, appealing to Karen Reynolds' presumed desire to control the narrative and perhaps offer her side of the story. She knew it was a long shot. A woman besieged by a global internet storm was unlikely to welcome an unsolicited inquiry from a freelance journalist. But Isabelle Dubois was not easily deterred. She had a story to uncover, a truth to seek, and a growing sense that the real story of Karen Slapsgard was far more complex and far more human than the viral outrage suggested. And she, with her outsider's eye and unwavering determination, was just the person to find it. Isabelle Dubois, her digital exploration of Karen Reynolds, yielding a polished but ultimately hollow facade, shifted her investigative focus towards the stoic center of the viral storm, Sergeant James Blackwood. While Karen's online persona presented a carefully curated image of privilege and perfection, James remained an enigma, a silent, inscrutable figure shrouded in the crimson and black of his Royal Guard uniform. The internet, so quick to dissect and condemn Karen, offered surprisingly little about the man she had slapped. Beyond the basic facts of his rank and regiment, Sergeant Blackwood remained a cipher, his inner life, his motivations, and his personal history obscured behind a wall of professional stoicism. This very lack of readily available information, however, piqued Isabelle's journalistic curiosity even further. In a world saturated with online oversharing and the relentless pursuit of personal branding, James Blackwood's digital anonymity felt almost deliberate, a conscious choice to maintain a private sphere separate from the voracious gaze of the public. And Isabelle, sensing a story waiting to be unearthed, decided to delve beneath the surface of public perception and explore the human being behind the uniform. Her search began not in the digital realm, but in the tangible reality of bricks and mortar, in the neighborhoods and communities that had shaped Sergeant Blackwood's life. Leaving behind the tourist throngs of central London, Isabelle ventured eastward, towards the less manicured, more authentically lived-in districts where the echoes of London's multicultural history resonated strongest. She sought out the areas where working-class families, immigrant communities, and the descendants of generations of Londoners carved out their lives, far from the gilded opulence of Buckingham Palace. Guided by fragments of information gleaned from sparse online mentions and discreet inquiries with contacts in the London press, Isabelle found herself in Brixton, a vibrant, bustling neighborhood pulsating with the rhythms of Afro-Caribbean culture. The air thrummed with reggae beats spilling from open doorways. The aroma of jerk chicken and spices hung heavy in the air, and the streets teemed with a kaleidoscope of faces, a vibrant tapestry of skin tones and accents that spoke of London's rich and complex immigrant history. It was here in the heart of Brixton that Isabelle began to piece together the fragments of James Blackwood's past. She started with local community centers, libraries, and churches, quietly inquiring about the Blackwood family, her questions carefully phrased, her approach respectful and unobtrusive. Initially, she met with polite but guarded responses. In a community accustomed to media scrutiny and often wary of outsiders, trust was not easily given. But Isabelle's persistence, her genuine curiosity, and her respectful demeanor, eventually, began to chip away at the wall of reticence. A kindly librarian, her eyes twinkling behind thick spectacles, recalled a young James Blackwood as a bright, quiet boy who devoured books with a voracious appetite. A neighborhood pastor, his voice resonant with the cadences of the Caribbean diaspora, remembered the Blackwood family as pillars of the local church, deeply involved in community outreach and quietly resilient in the face of hardship. And then, in a small, unassuming barbershop tucked away on a side street, Isabelle struck gold. An older barber, his hands moving with practiced ease as he trimmed a customer's hair, paused mid-sentence, his eyes widening slightly as Isabelle mentioned the name James Blackwood. James? Young James Blackwood? Sure, I remember him, the barber said, his voice laced with a hint of warmth and a touch of something else. Sadness? Pride? Isabelle couldn't quite decipher it. Good lad, James. Always was. Quiet, respectful, spine straighter than any ruler, even back then. Eh? He chuckled softly, a sound tinged with melancholy. Encouraged, Isabelle pressed further, gently probing for more details about James's childhood, his upbringing, his experiences growing up as a young black man in London. The barber, after a moment's hesitation, began to share fragments of memory, anecdotes and impressions that slowly began to paint a more nuanced portrait of the stoic Royal Guard. He spoke of James's quiet determination in the face of subtle and not so subtle prejudice, of the sting of racial slurs whispered in school hallways, the casual dismissiveness encountered in certain shops and neighborhoods, the unspoken but ever-present weight of societal expectations and limitations imposed upon young black men in a society still grappling with its colonial past and its lingering racial biases. The barber recounted a specific incident from James's teenage years, a story that resonated with a quiet power, illuminating the inner steel that forged beneath the surface of his stoic exterior. Young James, walking home from school one evening, had been accosted by a group of older boys, their taunts laced with racial epithets, their aggression escalating into physical intimidation. Instead of retaliating with anger or fear, James, outnumbered and outsized, had simply stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, his silence a more potent weapon than any shouted defiance. The older boys, perhaps unnerved by his unexpected composure, had eventually backed down, their taunts dissolving into mumbled curses as they retreated. "Never raised his voice, young James," the barber said, shaking his head in quiet admiration. "Just stood there straight as a ramrod, taking it all. But you could see it in his eyes, you know. The fire, the dignity. He wouldn't let them break him. Never would." As Isabelle listened to the barber's stories, a deeper understanding of Sergeant James Blackwood began to coalesce in her mind. His stoicism, his unwavering adherence to duty, his almost unnerving self-control, these were not merely the products of military training, but the carefully honed defenses of a young man who had learned early on to navigate a world that often judged him based on the color of his skin. His silence, she realized, was not just obedience, it was strength. His stillness, not just discipline, but a shield against the insidious arrows of prejudice. And the slap, that single impulsive act of provocation, had not merely struck a royal guard. It had struck a man who had already weathered countless, far more insidious blows in the silent battlefields of everyday life. Isabelle Dubois, the outsider's eye, was beginning to see beyond the viral spectacle and into the complex, resilient heart of the man at its center. The carefully crafted statement was disseminated through all available channels. A press release issued by a newly hired London-based PR firm. A video posted across Karen Reynolds's resurrected social media accounts, and even leaked to select mainstream news outlets for maximum amplification. The title itself was a study in carefully calibrated damage control. Ms. Karen Reynolds expresses regret for Buckingham Palace incident. Inside the opulent, if now somewhat oppressive confines of her hotel suite, Karen Reynolds rehearsed the lines one last time, her reflection in the gilded mirror offering a polished, if slightly strained visage of contrition. Her peach linen suit had been replaced by a more somber navy blue, the pearls exchanged for understated diamond studs, the carefully coiffed blonde bob now softened into a more natural, less overtly styled wave. Every detail had been meticulously considered, every nuance painstakingly orchestrated, all in the service of projecting an image of remorse. "I am deeply sorry," she recited, her voice measured, practiced, devoid of any genuine warmth, but carefully calibrated to convey a semblance of sincerity. "For my impulsive actions at Buckingham Palace. There is no excuse for disrespect, especially towards those who serve with such dedication." She paused, allowing the carefully crafted phrases to hang in the air, then forced a slight tremor into her voice, a subtle theatrical flourish. "I understand the gravity of my mistake, and I sincerely apologize to Sergeant Blackwood, to the Royal Guards, to the British people, and to everyone who was offended." Charles, hovering anxiously by the window, offered a hesitant nod. "It's good, Karen. Very appropriate, dignified, remorseful." He wrung his hands, his usual composure still fractured by nervous energy. "Do you feel it, though, darling? The remorse?" Karen's carefully constructed facade flickered for a fraction of a second, a brief glimpse of impatience flashing in her shielded eyes. "Charles, really? Must we delve into method acting now? The point is to convey remorse, isn't it? Not necessarily to..." Experience it viscerally. She sighed, smoothing the pristine fabric of her navy jacket. Honestly, this entire exercise feels utterly absurd. Kowtowing to the mob? Humiliating oneself for internet points? But even as she voiced her cynical disdain, a sliver of genuine unease began to creep into her carefully constructed armor of self-assurance. The sheer scale of the online backlash, the relentless torrent of condemnation, had begun to penetrate even her carefully guarded bubble of privilege. The mob, as she so dismissively termed it, was proving to be a far more formidable and persistent adversary than she had initially anticipated. The apology video was released, cascading across the digital landscape with the same viral velocity as the original slap video, but with a decidedly different reception. Instead of mollifying the outrage, it seemed to fuel it further. The internet, once united in its condemnation of Karen Reynolds, now turned its collective scrutiny towards the apology itself, dissecting every word, every gesture, every carefully modulated nuance of tone. The verdict was swift, brutal, and overwhelmingly negative. Fake. Insincere. Damage control. Comment sections exploded anew, this time with a fresh wave of anger and accusations. Screen caps of Karen's rehearsed performance were circulated and mocked, her carefully crafted phrases dissected and derided. The internet, it seemed, was not buying it. The apology, far from extinguishing the flames of outrage, had merely poured gasoline on the fire. Sergeant James Blackwood, sequestered in the relative quiet of his barracks, watched the apology video. On a small, flickering screen, his expression as impassive and unreadable as ever. He listened to the carefully crafted words, observed the meticulously rehearsed gestures, and felt nothing. Or rather, not nothingness, but a cold, hollow emptiness, a profound sense of disconnect. The apology, with its carefully constructed remorse and its polished veneer of sincerity, felt utterly divorced from the reality of the incident, from the sting of the slap, from the weight of the public humiliation, from the quiet, simmering anger that he had so diligently suppressed. It was a performance, a carefully calculated piece of public relations theater, designed to appease the mob and salvage a damaged reputation, but utterly lacking in genuine human feeling. He saw no remorse in her eyes, no flicker of true regret in her carefully modulated voice. He heard only the hollow echo of carefully chosen words, devoid of substance, devoid of authenticity, devoid of any real understanding of the offense she had caused. The apology, far from healing the wound, felt like a further insult, a dismissive gesture that trivialized the significance of the event and further underscored the chasm of understanding that separated them. Disappointment, cold, and sharp settled in his chest, a heavy weight pressing down on his already burdened spirit. He had not expected a grand, public mea culpa, nor did he crave personal vindication, but he had, perhaps naively, hoped for something more. A glimmer of genuine understanding, a flicker of authentic regret, a whisper of human connection that might bridge the chasm of cultural and societal divide. Instead, he received a carefully packaged performance, a hollow echo devoid of meaning, a late apology that felt in its very artifice like no apology at all. Isabelle Dubois, observing, the online firestorm ignited by Karen Reynolds' apology video from her quiet hotel room, felt a renewed surge of journalistic skepticism. The apology, meticulously crafted and strategically disseminated, struck her as wrong, too polished, too rehearsed, too devoid of genuine emotion. It was the apology of a brand, not a person, a carefully calculated attempt to manage a crisis, not a sincere expression of regret. The overwhelming negative reaction from the online public, the near unanimous rejection of Karen's carefully crafted remorse, only solidified Isabelle's doubts. The internet, in its often unpredictable wisdom, seemed to sense the insincerity, to recognize the performance for what it was, a hollow gesture, a late apology that rang utterly false. And Isabelle Dubois, the outsider's eye, knew that her investigation was far from over. The polished facade of Karen Reynolds' public apology had only deepened her suspicion and strengthened her resolve to uncover the real story beneath the viral storm. The true apology, she sensed if it were to ever come, would have to be far more profound and far more authentic than anything Karen Reynolds or her PR team had yet offered to the world. Isabelle Dubois, perched on the edge of her hotel bed, her small room now littered with notebooks, transcripts, and printouts from her burgeoning investigation, was beginning to feel the familiar itch of journalistic momentum. The polished pronouncements and carefully constructed apologies of Karen Reynolds had only solidified her skepticism, and her forays into the Brixton community had provided valuable texture and context, hinting at the deeper currents of prejudice and societal tension that underscored the viral sensation. But she was still missing something, a crucial piece of the puzzle that would elevate the story beyond a simple case of bad manners and online outrage. She needed a new thread to pull, a fresh angle to explore, a whisper of truth amidst the deafening roar of public opinion. Just as a sense of slight frustration began to creep in, the shrill ring of her hotel room phone shattered the quiet concentration. Isabelle frowned, glancing at the antiquated device with a slight air of annoyance. She rarely used the room phone, preferring the digital efficiency of her mobile. Hesitantly, she picked up the receiver, bringing it to her ear. "Dubois," she answered, her voice crisp and professional. Silence met her at the other end of the line, a disconcerting void punctuated only by the faint static hiss of an international connection. Isabelle frowned again, pulling the receiver slightly away from her ear, suspecting a wrong number or a silent prank call. "Hello?" she repeated, her tone now edged with impatience. "Is anyone there?" Then, a voice, low and distorted, filtered through the line, barely above a whisper, yet carrying a strange undercurrent of urgency. It was a male voice, heavily accented, possibly Eastern European, but deliberately muffled, as if the speaker was attempting to disguise their identity. "Mademoiselle Dubois?" The voice rasped, the French address slightly mispronounced, yet undeniably directed at her. Isabelle's journalist's instincts immediately sharpened. This was no wrong number. This was deliberate. "Speaking," she replied, her voice now alert, all traces of annoyance banished. "I have information," the voice continued, each word carefully measured, hesitant, as if weighed down by the gravity of the message. "Information about the American woman, Reynolds." Isabelle's pulse quickened. This was it. The thread she had been searching for. She gripped the receiver tighter, her senses on high alert. "What kind of information?" she prompted, her voice low and steady, mirroring the speaker's deliberate cadence. The voice hesitated again, the static hiss filling the brief silence, amplifying the sense of mystery and clandestine communication. "It is not simple. More than meets the eye. The slap. It was not random." Isabelle's mind raced, trying to decipher the cryptic pronouncements. "Not random? What do you mean? Are you saying it was planned?" The idea, outlandish just moments ago, now hung heavy in the air, charged with a sudden, unsettling plausibility. Planned. Perhaps orchestrated. By others. The voice whispered, the words fragmented, elliptical, yet undeniably suggestive. "Look deeper. Mademoiselle Dubois. Follow the money. Follow the connections. It is bigger than you think. Bigger than I think." Isabelle repeated, her mind struggling to grasp the implications. "Bigger how? Bigger than what?" The voice chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that sent a shiver down Isabelle's spine. "Politics, mademoiselle. Power. Reputation. These are valuable commodities, and some will pay any price to control them." Before Isabelle could press for more details, before she could even formulate a coherent question, the line went dead. The static hiss returned, a mocking emptiness where the cryptic voice had been just moments before. Isabelle stared at the receiver in her hand, the silence now feeling heavy, pregnant with unspoken implications. She hung up the phone slowly, her mind reeling, piecing together the fragments of the anonymous caller's message. Not random, orchestrated, by others. Politics, power, reputation. The words echoed in her mind, disjointed yet strangely resonant, like pieces of a shattered mirror reflecting a distorted image of reality. Orchestrated? By whom? And for what purpose? The idea of Karen Reynolds' impulsive slap being part of some grand conspiracy seemed almost ludicrous, bordering on the outlandish. And yet the caller's voice, the hushed urgency, the cryptic pronouncements, had carried a weight of conviction that Isabelle could not easily dismiss. Follow the money. Follow the connections. The instructions, though vague, were undeniably intriguing, a breadcrumb trail leading into the unknown. Isabelle glanced around her small hotel room, the familiar space now feeling subtly charged with a new sense of mystery and intrigue. The Karen Slapsguard story, initially a straightforward narrative of online outrage and cultural clash, had suddenly morphed into something far more complex, potentially far more dangerous. A conspiracy? Political maneuvering? It seemed improbable, almost fantastical. And yet, her journalistic instincts, honed by years of chasing down elusive truths and navigating the murky waters of human deception, were screaming at her to investigate, to dig deeper, to follow the whispered clues, however improbable they seemed. The anonymous call, with its cryptic pronouncements and unsettling undertones, had planted a seed of doubt, a seed of suspicion that had taken root in Isabelle's mind. And Isabelle Dubois, the outsider's eye, knew that she had no choice but to follow that seed, to see where it might lead, and to uncover the truth, however deeply buried and potentially dangerous it might be. The game, it seemed, had just changed, and the real story of Karen Slapsguard, she suspected, was only just beginning to unfold. Trafalgar Square, usually bustling and vibrant, wore an unfamiliar tranquility this afternoon. The usual clamor of tourists and the vibrant sounds of street performers had yielded to an unusually solemn silence. Instead, an atmosphere of tension, a palpable anticipation, permeated the vast square. Only a scattering of people lingered near Nelson's column, their eyes all directed towards a single point, as if awaiting a momentous ceremony about to unfold. Even the pigeons, typically bold and noisy, seemed more reserved, their soft cooing further emphasizing the stillness of the afternoon. Isabelle Dubois, her familiar notebook in hand, stood quietly beneath one of the majestic stone lions, her sharp gray-blue eyes constantly observing, registering every detail, however minute, in the square. She keenly sensed the difference in the atmosphere today. This silence was not the usual everyday peace, but a quietude before a storm, a stillness, laden with unspoken undertones and anticipation. She had proactively arranged this meeting, this direct and uncompromising confrontation, with utmost caution and a hint of daring. Within Isabelle, hope and anxiety were interwoven. Hope that this direct confrontation would shatter the defensive shell, reveal genuine emotions, and open a path leading to understanding. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the apprehension that all efforts might prove futile, that the invisible barriers separating Karen and James, between pride and self-respect, between prejudice and empathy, remained too vast, too insurmountable. From afar, Karen Reynolds emerged, her figure lonely and small amidst the expansive square. Unlike her usual flamboyant and luxurious appearances in magazines and on social media, Karen was simpler today. A plain charcoal gray coat concealed her designer outfit, her face lightly made up, her usually lustrous blonde hair neatly tied back. Karen's outward appearance conveyed weariness, anxiety, yet concealed within was a determination, a readiness to face what awaited her. Beside her, Charles Sterling, Karen's steadfast companion, remained silently supportive. His expression hinted at worry, but his eyes also glimmered with a trace of hope, a belief that this confrontation could bring a turning point to the current situation. Isabelle took a deep breath, steeling herself for this crucial confrontation. She knew this was no ordinary interview, but a meeting between individuals bearing wounds, burdens, and a yearning to be understood. The success of this confrontation depended on the sincerity, openness, and courage of all three. As Karen approached, Isabelle took the initiative to greet her. The two women exchanged silent glances, a wordless greeting encompassing empathy and a hint of reserve. Charles gave Isabelle a slight nod, a courteous and formal greeting, before discreetly stepping back, respecting the need for private space for the dialogue. Immediately after, from the direction of Nelson's column, the tall and familiar figure of Sergeant James Blackwood appeared. Today, James was not clad in his striking scarlet ceremonial uniform, but in the simple, everyday olive green uniform of his duty. This change of attire seemed to lessen some of the usual formality and solemnity, but James's posture remained unwavering. He walked with his familiar firm, measured stride, each step steady and rhythmic, emanating the ingrained steadfastness and discipline of a soldier. James's face retained its usual composure, betraying no emotion, but deep within his dark brown eyes, Isabelle discerned a different glimmer, a gentler, more open light compared to his customary cold detachment. James approached Karen and Isabelle, stopping at a point that formed a triangle in the square. The surrounding space seemed to hold its breath, all sounds diminishing, leaving only the gentle breeze through the square and the distant cooing of pigeons. Three individuals stood amidst the vast space, each bearing their own distinct mood and story, yet sharing a common desire, to seek truth and an escape from misunderstandings and hurt. Isabelle's voice, soft yet clear, broke the heavy silence. "We are here today, in this very place where everything began. I believe that perhaps the time has come for us to have a truly honest conversation, not just with each other, but also with ourselves." She paused briefly, allowing the silence to envelop them all, then continued, turning her gaze towards Karen. "Ms. Reynolds, would you like to speak first?" Karen trembled slightly, taking a deep breath as if gathering all her courage. Her gaze finally shifted towards James. For the first time since the incident at the palace, she looked directly into his dark brown eyes, without flinching, without arrogance, but with an expression laden with complex emotions, remorse and repentance. "Sergeant Blackwood, James," Karen's voice was barely a whisper, faltering, losing its usual strength and confidence. I am truly sorry." The apology escaped Karen's lips, sounding both weighty and liberating. She continued, her voice choked with emotion. "My public apology, perhaps it was inadequate. I know words cannot erase my thoughtless action, but I want you to believe that I am truly remorseful, not just because of the consequences I am facing, the criticism from the public, but truly from the bottom of my heart. I feel deeply ashamed." Karen paused, trying to control her trembling voice. "I acted foolishly, thoughtlessly, and utterly disrespectfully. I have no excuse for my action." Trafalgar Square, usually a vibrant tableau of bustling humanity, held a different air this afternoon. The usual cheerful cacophony of tourist chatter, the lively melodies of street performers, the playful shrieks of children chasing pigeons. All were conspicuously absent, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Instead, a palpable tension permeated the vast expanse, a hushed expectancy hanging heavy in the air like the threat of an unseasonal storm. The very stones beneath foot seemed to hum with anticipation, mirroring the collective breath held by the sparse crowd that had gathered, as if summoned by an unseen force near the imposing silhouette of Nelson's column. Even the pigeons, normally audacious and clamorous denizens of the square, appeared subdued, their cooing muted and hesitant, as if instinctively sensing the unusual gravity of the moment. The vibrant heart of London, for this brief suspended interlude, beat with a slower, more deliberate rhythm, attuned to the unspoken drama about to unfold. Isabelle Dubois, ever the diligent observer, stood almost imperceptibly blended into the scene, positioned near the leonine grandeur of one of the stone guardians flanking Nelson's column. Her familiar notebook, a silent confidant and repository of countless untold stories, was clutched firmly in her hand, a tangible anchor in the sea of unspoken emotions swirling around her. Her sharp gray-blue eyes, usually sparkling with journalistic curiosity and intellectual engagement, were today narrowed slightly, her gaze sweeping across the square with a focused intensity, meticulously cataloging every subtle shift in atmosphere, every nuanced expression on the faces of the scattered onlookers. She was a seasoned chronicler of human experience, and she recognized the telltale signs of a moment pregnant with consequence, a juncture where individual destinies and public perception were poised to collide. Isabelle felt a familiar cocktail of emotions churning within her, a potent blend of professional detachment and deeply human empathy. She had orchestrated this meeting, this carefully calibrated confrontation, not as a mere observer, but as a catalyst, hoping to ignite a spark of genuine dialogue amidst the suffocating fog of public outrage and manufactured narratives. Hope and trepidation wrestled within her. Hope that the stark honesty of a face-to-face encounter would finally shatter the carefully constructed layers of artifice and misrepresentation, revealing, at long last, a glimpse of unvarnished truth. Hope that genuine remorse and forgiveness might, against all odds, find a fragile foothold in this emotionally charged arena. But alongside hope, a persistent thread of trepidation tugged at her resolve. Trepidation that the chasm of misunderstanding and resentment might prove too vast to bridge, that ingrained prejudices and wounded pride might prove insurmountable barriers to authentic connection. Trepidation that this carefully staged confrontation might, despite her best intentions, devolve into further acrimony, further entrenching the very divide she desperately hoped to mend. From the periphery of the square, Karen Reynolds materialized, her approach hesitant, her posture conveying a vulnerability starkly at odds with the image of imperious self-assurance she had unwittingly projected onto the global stage. Her figure, usually radiating an aura of confident command, seemed diminished, almost frail, against the imposing backdrop of Trafalgar Square. Today, the meticulously curated facade was gone, replaced by a stark and unadorned reality. The designer ensemble had been exchanged for a simple, charcoal gray coat that seemed to swallow her petite frame, offering a semblance of anonymity rather than the usual declaration of affluence. Her face, devoid of its customary flawless makeup, revealed the lines of stress etched by days under the relentless glare of public scrutiny, her usually vibrant blonde hair pulled back in a severely practical style, devoid of its usual artful coiffure. The transformation was striking, almost jarring. Karen Reynolds, stripped bare of her carefully constructed artifice, appeared not as a caricature of entitled arrogance, but as a recognizably human figure, weary, anxious, and carrying the palpable weight of her public transgression. Yet, despite the evident strain, Isabelle also detected a flicker of something else in Karen's demeanor, a nascent resolve, a quiet determination that suggested a willingness to confront the consequences of her actions, to engage, however daunting, the prospect, with the arduous process of genuine contrition. Beside her, a silent sentinel of support, walked Charles Sterling, his usual urbane composure replaced by a palpable air of protective concern, his eyes constantly scanning the faces. In the sparse crowd, a silent guardian shielding his friend from the lingering hostility of public gaze. Isabelle straightened her posture, mentally steeling herself for the delicate task ahead. She knew this was not merely an interview, not just another journalistic assignment to be clinically dissected and reported. This was a deeply human encounter, a convergence of individuals bearing raw wounds, heavy burdens of expectation, and a profound, if often unspoken, yearning for understanding and perhaps even reconciliation. The success.
And if this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps me to continue creating more amazing stories. Thank you for listening.